Now reporting, David Muir.
Good evening. We're coming back on the air at this hour because there's been a development in the search for Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old mother of Today Show host Savannah Guthrie. The Pima County Sheriff's Department, with assistance from the FBI, has detained an individual at this hour for questioning in connection with the abduction of Nancy Guthrie. Again, a person detained in connection with this case.
Let me be direct with you before a single second passes. What you are about to hear is not recycled headline content. It is not the surface-level grief coverage that many outlets have repeated since Nancy Guthrie disappeared. What this is a careful examination of the publicly available information surrounding the case, the investigative questions that naturally arise in a high-profile disappearance, and the broader forensic and procedural realities that shape investigations of this kind. This video is not an accusation against any individual, and it does not claim access to confidential law enforcement evidence. Instead, it is an analysis of what has been publicly reported, what remains unknown, and why the case continues to attract intense public attention. There is something distinctly different about a case like this one. Most missing person investigations, as tragic as they are, do not reach a national audience within the first 72 hours. Most families do not find themselves simultaneously navigating the private devastation of uncertainty while also watching that devastation be discussed, analyzed, theorized about, and sometimes weaponized across social media platforms, podcasts, YouTube channels, Reddit threads, and cable news segments. The Guthrie family is navigating exactly that kind of double exposure, and it matters that those of us covering the case do so with the gravity the situation demands. One of the people whose name has surfaced repeatedly in online discussion is Tommaso. He is Savannah Guthrie's brother-in-law through his marriage to Annie Guthrie, Savannah's sister. He is also Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law and therefore part of the extended family directly affected by this disappearance. Nancy Guthrie, now missing for 96 days, remains at the center of an investigation that has generated enormous public speculation, emotional strain, and widespread media coverage. The central question in this case is not whether internet theories are correct. It is whether investigators can determine exactly what happened to Nancy Guthrie through evidence, witness interviews, digital analysis, and forensic examination. That process is often far slower and more methodical than the public expects. Throughout this video, we are going to examine the known facts, the unresolved questions, and the investigative procedures that commonly apply in cases involving missing persons. We are going to do this thoroughly, carefully, and at the length and depth this case genuinely requires. Welcome to TrueCrimeHEX. If you are not yet subscribed, hit that notification bell and stay connected because we are committed to covering developments in this case carefully, critically, and in as much depth as publicly available information allows. This analysis is going to cover a great deal of territory. We are going to talk about Tommaso and the way online commentary has treated his connection to this case. We are going to examine the investigative procedures that apply in complex missing person cases. We are going to discuss forensic science in realistic rather than dramatic terms. We are going to explore behavioral analysis, digital evidence, community reporting, international investigative considerations, and the psychological toll that prolonged public scrutiny places on families. And we are going to come back, again and again, to the discipline that responsible true crime coverage demands, the discipline of distinguishing between what is confirmed, what is theorized, and what remains entirely unknown. Let us begin. Before any serious analysis can begin, it is necessary to establish what is actually confirmed in this case versus what has been generated through the organic but often unreliable machinery of public speculation. This distinction is not a minor procedural courtesy. It is the structural foundation upon which everything else must rest. Without it, analysis becomes indistinguishable from rumor, and coverage becomes indistinguishable from the kind of online mob dynamics that have historically harmed innocent people and complicated legitimate investigations. What we know publicly and with reasonable confidence is this: Nancy Guthrie, the mother of Savannah Guthrie and Annie Guthrie, was reported missing from her home in Tucson, Arizona. Tucson is a city of roughly 500,000 people situated in Pima County in the southern part of Arizona, approximately 60 miles north of the United States-Mexico border. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has taken an active role in the investigation, with Sheriff Chris Nanos appearing publicly to address the case on multiple occasions. The disappearance quickly received national media coverage, in large part because of Savannah Guthrie's prominent role as a co-anchor on NBC's Today Show. Since the disappearance was reported, investigators have been working through what appears to be a genuinely complex set of circumstances. Public statements from law enforcement have been measured and carefully worded, consistent with the approach agencies typically adopt during ongoing investigations. Evidence has reportedly been collected and submitted for forensic analysis. Names have entered public discussion, some through official channels and some through less verifiable routes. Among the names that entered public discussion relatively early was Luke Daly, whose name appeared in connection with law enforcement activity in the Tucson area that received local media coverage. Public records indicate that Daly carries a prior criminal history. However, and this point must be stated emphatically, the existence of prior criminal history is not itself evidence of involvement in any specific crime. Investigators regularly speak to individuals with criminal histories during complex investigations simply because those individuals may have information, may have been present in relevant areas, or may be connected to other people of interest through prior relationships or shared environments. Prior conviction history is one data point among many, not a definitive indicator of current guilt. What has not been publicly confirmed includes a definitive timeline of Nancy Guthrie's final known movements, the nature and results of forensic evidence collected during the investigation, whether any individual has been officially named as a suspect by law enforcement, whether any ransom demand or communication of any kind was received, and whether investigators have identified any single theory of the case as their primary working hypothesis. All of those questions remain open in public reporting. That openness is uncomfortable. It creates space for speculation to rush in where facts have not yet arrived. But the discomfort of uncertainty is not a justification for replacing that uncertainty with invented certainty. 96 days is a long time in terms of human experience and emotional endurance. It is not necessarily a long time in terms of complex forensic investigation. We will return to this point repeatedly, because the public's understanding of investigative timelines is often dramatically distorted by fictional portrayals and simplified media coverage. Now let us talk about Tommaso Soni in the depth this discussion deserves, because much of the online conversation surrounding him has been shaped by his connection to a highly visible media family, and that connection has sometimes been treated as though it were itself evidence of something significant. Soni is an Italian-born individual who became part of the Guthrie family through his marriage to Annie Guthrie, Savannah Guthrie's sister. Through that marriage, he became Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law, making him a member of the extended family directly affected by Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. By public appearances and available reporting, Soni and Annie Guthrie maintained a relatively private life, as is common for relatives of media figures who do not themselves work in public-facing roles. The fact that Soni is Italian-born has attracted a specific and particularly concerning variety of online speculation. Commentators across various platforms have attempted to connect his national origin to theories involving foreign financial networks, organized criminal infrastructure, or international conspiracy. Let us address this directly and without equivocation. A person's nationality is not evidence of criminal involvement in anything. It is not a suspicious characteristic. It does not raise legitimate investigative red flags simply by virtue of existing. The conflation of foreign background with criminal suspicion is a form of bias that has no place in serious investigative analysis, and it has absolutely no place in responsible true crime coverage. Any discussion of Tommaso Soni that treats his Italian origin as inherently meaningful in a criminal context is engaging in something much closer to prejudice than to analysis. What is genuinely relevant from an investigative standpoint when discussing family members connected to a missing person case is something much more structural and procedural. In any investigation involving a missing person, law enforcement professionals systematically interview individuals who were part of the missing person's life. That includes immediate family members, extended family members, close friends, neighbors, regular service providers, healthcare contacts, and anyone else who may have had regular or recent contact with the individual before the disappearance. This interview process serves multiple purposes simultaneously. First, it helps investigators build a detailed and accurate portrait of the missing person's daily life, including routines, relationships, financial circumstances, health status, emotional state, and any unusual recent events or changes in behavior. Second, it helps investigators construct a timeline, identifying the last known points of contact and working backward and forward from those points to understand what may have occurred. Third, it allows investigators to identify inconsistencies, unexpected gaps, or surprising pieces of information that may redirect the inquiry toward previously unconsidered possibilities. Fourth, it gives investigators a baseline of information against which subsequent discoveries can be measured. In that context, it would be entirely standard and appropriate for investigators to speak with Tommaso as part of their broader effort to understand Nancy Guthrie's life, her relationships, her circumstances, and the events surrounding her disappearance. Being interviewed in connection with a missing person investigation is not equivalent to being accused of involvement. It is often simply a reflection of proximity, relationship, and the availability of potentially useful information. The geographic separation between the Guthrie family members living in New York and Nancy Guthrie's residence in Tucson, Arizona has naturally become part of public discussion surrounding the case. Elderly individuals living independently can sometimes face increased vulnerability, particularly when daily contact with relatives occurs across long distances rather than in person. Investigators in missing person cases routinely examine not just the physical environment of the missing person but also the structure and quality of their social support network, the regularity of contact with family members, and whether any changes in that contact pattern preceded the disappearance. As a member of the extended family, Tommaso may well have been familiar with aspects of Nancy Guthrie's routines and living situation through ordinary family interaction. He may have visited, may have communicated regularly, may have been aware of her habits, or her household arrangements. That kind of familiarity is entirely normal within family relationships and does not constitute anything approaching suspicious knowledge. Investigators speak with family members precisely because family members often hold the kind of detailed, intimate knowledge of a person's life that can be extraordinarily useful in building a picture of their circumstances. The important distinction in a case like this, and it cannot be overstated, is between possibility and evidence. The online commentary surrounding Tommaso has sometimes operated as though possibility and evidence were the same thing. They are not. The possibility that a family member might have access to certain information is not evidence that they used that information for harmful purposes. The possibility that geographic connections exist is not evidence of conspiracy. The possibility that someone might theoretically benefit from a situation is not evidence that they caused it. Investigators work in the world of evidence, documentation, corroboration, and legal standards. Public speculation does not. To understand what is happening in the Nancy Guthrie investigation, it helps enormously to understand what complex missing person investigations actually look like from the inside, as opposed to how they are typically portrayed in dramatized media. The gap between those two pictures is substantial, and failing to understand that gap leads directly to the kind of frustrated speculation that distorts public discourse around ongoing cases. When a person is reported missing under circumstances that suggest potential criminal involvement rather than voluntary departure, law enforcement agencies typically activate a multi-layered response relatively quickly. In a case involving an elderly woman with established community ties and no apparent reason to disappear voluntarily, investigators would generally move quickly to treat the disappearance as a potential crime rather than waiting to see whether the individual returns on their own. The initial investigative phase focuses on rapid information gathering. Investigators interview anyone who had recent contact with the missing person. They examine the physical environment, looking for signs of struggle, forced entry, unusual activity, or anything else that disrupts the expected appearance of the space. They canvass the neighborhood, speaking with neighbors and reviewing any available surveillance footage from home cameras, doorbell cameras, traffic cameras, or commercial security systems. They examine the missing person's communication records, looking for patterns, recent contacts, and any unusual exchanges. They also begin the process of preserving potential evidence before it can be altered, contaminated, or lost. In the case of Nancy Guthrie, the Tucson location adds specific contextual dimensions. Pima County is large and geographically diverse, encompassing urban neighborhoods, suburban developments, and significant areas of desert terrain. Search operations in that kind of environment present genuine logistical challenges. Ground searches, aerial surveys, and cadaver dog deployments all operate differently in desert conditions than they do in more temperate environments. Heat, terrain, and the particular characteristics of the Sonoran desert landscape all factor into how investigators plan and execute search operations. The proximity of Tucson to the United States-Mexico border has also naturally entered public discussion, and it deserves careful treatment. International proximity is a legitimate factor that investigators in border regions must consider as part of their standard framework. Law enforcement agencies in southern Arizona have established protocols for coordinating with federal agencies and, when appropriate, with Mexican authorities on cases that may have cross-border dimensions. However, the mere geographic fact of border proximity does not automatically implicate cross-border activity in any specific case. Investigators would need actual evidence suggesting cross-border movement before that dimension becomes a meaningful investigative direction rather than a geographical coincidence. As investigations develop past the initial phase, they typically become more focused on evidence analysis and lead pursuit rather than broad information gathering. Forensic evidence collected during searches and from crime scenes is submitted to laboratory facilities for analysis. Those analyses can include fingerprint examination, DNA profiling, trace evidence analysis, digital forensics, toxicological testing, and a range of other specialized procedures. Each type of analysis operates on its own timeline, and those timelines are not always predictable. Laboratory capacity, case prioritization, evidence complexity, and the availability of comparison samples all affect how long forensic analysis takes. This is a point where public expectation and investigative reality diverge most dramatically. Television crime dramas have created a widespread public impression that DNA analysis produces results within hours, that digital forensics instantly reveals complete communication histories, and that forensic examination quickly delivers clear and definitive answers. In reality, DNA analysis often takes weeks or months. Digital forensics can take even longer, particularly when devices are encrypted, damaged, or associated with cloud services that require legal process to access. Even fingerprint examination, one of the older and more established forensic techniques, requires careful comparison work that takes time when evidence is fragmentary or degraded. The pace of the Nancy Guthrie investigation should therefore be understood within this realistic framework rather than the dramatized one. The fact that 96 days have passed without a public arrest or definitive public announcement about the case does not indicate investigative failure, hidden information, or a cover-up of any kind. It may simply reflect the genuine complexity of the evidentiary picture and the time required to work through it properly. Few areas of investigative science have captured public imagination as completely as digital forensics. The idea that modern devices leave comprehensive, permanent, and easily accessible records of human activity is deeply embedded in public consciousness, and it has generated enormous amounts of online speculation about what investigators must already know in cases like this one. The reality is significantly more complicated, and understanding those complications is essential to accurately evaluating what digital evidence might contribute to the Nancy Guthrie investigation. Modern smartphones generate extraordinary amounts of data. Location services, when enabled, can record movement with remarkable precision. Communication applications maintain records of messages, calls, and contacts. Photographs carry metadata indicating when and where they were taken. Application usage logs record when specific apps were opened and used. Even ambient data like Wi-Fi connection logs and Bluetooth pairing histories can help reconstruct a device's physical location and proximity to other devices at specific times. However, accessing that data legally requires following procedures that protect constitutional rights and preserve the evidentiary integrity of any information obtained. Law enforcement agencies must generally obtain search warrants supported by probable cause before accessing the contents of a private individual's phone. Depending on the specific platform and service involved, they may also need to serve legal process on technology companies to obtain cloud-stored data or communication records. Those companies have their own legal review processes, and they do not always respond quickly or produce exactly the information investigators requested. Even when data is obtained, interpreting it accurately requires significant expertise. Location data can appear more precise than it actually is, because the GPS signals that generate location estimates carry inherent margins of error that vary with environmental conditions. Cell tower location data, which is often easier to obtain than GPS data, provides much lower precision, sometimes placing a device within a radius of several miles rather than at a specific address. Investigators and their technical experts must understand and account for these limitations when building location timelines. Vehicle data has become another significant source of investigative information in recent years. Modern vehicles maintain internal computers that record a wide range of operational data, including speed, braking patterns, steering inputs, and sometimes GPS navigation histories. Many vehicles also pair with smartphones through Bluetooth, creating pairing records that may identify which devices were present in the vehicle and when. Newer vehicles with embedded cellular connectivity may transmit location data to manufacturer servers that investigators can potentially access through appropriate legal process. The value of this kind of vehicle data in an investigation depends heavily on the specific make, model, and year of the vehicles involved, the legal accessibility of the data, and the interpretive expertise available to investigators. It also depends on whether investigators have specific vehicles they believe are relevant. Vehicle forensics is a powerful tool when investigators know what they are looking for, but it requires a prior theory or evidence trail to point them in the right direction. Social media forensics represents yet another dimension of digital investigation that has grown dramatically in importance. Platforms maintain extensive records of user activity, including posts, messages, searches, account interactions, and IP addresses associated with logins. Investigators can sometimes reconstruct detailed pictures of relationships, communications, and states of mind through careful examination of social media records. They can also sometimes identify individuals who had contact with a missing person through social media connections that might not have been apparent to family members or other traditional contacts. However, social media forensics also has significant limitations. Platforms vary in how long they retain data and what they preserve. Legal process requirements differ by platform and jurisdiction. Data obtained from social media may be ambiguous, incomplete, or subject to multiple interpretations. And the sheer volume of digital activity associated with most modern adults means that investigators must exercise significant judgment about which portions of the digital record are actually relevant rather than simply overwhelming. In the context of the Nancy Guthrie investigation, the realistic picture of digital forensics is this: investigators almost certainly have developed significant digital evidence from multiple sources, and they are working to interpret that evidence within the broader context of physical evidence and witness accounts. But the analysis of that evidence takes time, requires expertise, and may not yield the kind of clean, unambiguous answers that public audiences expect and online commentators often assume already exist. Another area where public expectation and investigative reality diverge significantly is behavioral analysis. The concept of behavioral profiling, which has been popularized extensively through television dramas and true crime media, has created a widespread impression that trained investigators can accurately determine criminal culpability simply by observing how someone speaks, moves, or reacts during interviews and public appearances. This impression is not supported by the current state of behavioral science. Behavioral analysis, when practiced by trained and credentialed professionals within appropriate investigative contexts, can serve legitimate and useful functions. It can help investigators develop interview strategies tailored to specific personality types. It can provide frameworks for evaluating the consistency of accounts given by witnesses or persons of interest over time. It can help investigators identify questions they should be asking or avenues of inquiry they might not have considered. It can contribute to threat assessment processes in certain categories of cases. What behavioral analysis cannot reliably do, despite popular claims to the contrary, is definitively identify liars, detect guilt, or accurately predict criminal behavior based on observable characteristics. The scientific literature on deception detection is, to put it charitably, humbling. Studies have consistently found that human beings, including trained law enforcement officers, perform barely above chance when attempting to distinguish truthful statements from deceptive ones based on behavioral cues alone. The famous list of supposed deception indicators, including avoiding eye contact, touching the face, pausing before answering, or using overly formal language, has been repeatedly examined and repeatedly found to be unreliable as a guide to truthfulness. This matters enormously in the context of how public audiences evaluate the behavior of individuals connected to the Nancy Guthrie case. Online commentators have frequently analyzed public appearances by family members, including interviews, social media posts, and media statements, and offered confident conclusions about those individuals' emotional authenticity, credibility, and potential guilt based on behavioral observations. Those conclusions have no solid scientific foundation. People who are innocent of any wrongdoing may appear nervous, evasive, or emotionally flat in public contexts for an enormous range of entirely innocent reasons. Grief does not follow a consistent or predictable script. Individuals who are naturally introverted, who are experiencing significant anxiety about their own public exposure, or who are managing the cognitive demands of an extremely stressful situation may display behavioral characteristics that amateur observers interpret as suspicious simply because they diverge from expectations. Tommaso, like any other person in the extended Guthrie family, is navigating an experience that most people will thankfully never face. He is watching a family member's disappearance become the subject of national media coverage. He is watching his own name circulate through online spaces where people who know nothing about him are constructing confident narratives about his character and potential criminal culpability. He is presumably experiencing profound concern and distress about Nancy Guthrie's fate. Any of those circumstances alone could produce behavioral characteristics that an uninformed observer might misinterpret. The combination of all of them would be genuinely extraordinary to manage. The lesson here, and it applies broadly rather than only to this specific individual, is that behavioral observation from a distance, mediated through news cameras and social media posts, provides essentially no reliable information about whether a person is involved in criminal activity. Investigators who have direct, repeated, and carefully structured contact with individuals in the context of a formal investigation are in a much better position to evaluate behavioral consistency and credibility. But even they must treat behavioral indicators as one component of a much larger evidentiary picture rather than as standalone proof of anything. Public understanding of forensic science has been significantly shaped by television dramas that prioritize dramatic revelation over scientific accuracy. The gap between the forensic science that appears on screen and the forensic science that operates in real-world investigations is substantial enough that legal scholars have given it a name: the CSI effect. The CSI effect refers to the tendency of jurors, and by extension the general public, to expect forensic evidence to be comprehensive, certain, and dramatically conclusive in ways that actual forensic science rarely delivers. Understanding forensic science in realistic terms is essential to accurately evaluating what evidence might mean in the Nancy Guthrie investigation. DNA evidence, perhaps the most powerful and widely discussed forensic tool, operates within significant practical constraints. DNA analysis requires biological samples of sufficient quality and quantity to produce interpretable results. Environmental factors, including heat, humidity, sunlight exposure, and contamination, can degrade DNA rapidly. In an outdoor environment like the Sonoran Desert, biological evidence can deteriorate within hours or days under extreme conditions. Even in indoor environments, the presence of multiple people creates complex mixed samples that require sophisticated statistical analysis to interpret. When investigators do obtain usable DNA profiles from evidence, they must then have comparison samples to match against. If a DNA profile cannot be matched to any known individual in available databases, it provides no immediate identification value, though it can still be preserved for potential future comparison. The development of forensic genealogy techniques, which use publicly accessible ancestry databases to identify possible relatives of unknown DNA contributors and thereby narrow investigative leads, has expanded the practical utility of unknown DNA profiles. But forensic genealogy is a time-intensive process with legal and ethical dimensions that constrain its application. Fingerprint evidence, while well-established, also operates within limitations that television rarely depicts accurately. Fingerprints recovered from crime scenes are frequently partial, smudged, distorted by surface texture, or otherwise degraded. The computer matching algorithms used to search fingerprint databases produce candidate matches rather than definitive identifications, and human examiners must evaluate candidate matches using established criteria that involve significant subjective judgment. The once absolute status of fingerprint evidence has been reconsidered in recent decades as the scientific community has applied more rigorous standards to the field's foundational assumptions. Trace evidence, including fibers, hair, soil particles, glass fragments, and other microscopic materials, can provide powerful investigative leads when properly collected, preserved, and analyzed. But trace evidence is also susceptible to transfer and contamination in ways that complicate interpretation. The Locard exchange principle, which holds that every contact leaves a trace, is scientifically valid but does not automatically produce simple, interpretable evidence. Fibers transfer between people and environments constantly in the course of ordinary life, making the presence of trace evidence on a person or in a location suggestive rather than conclusive without additional context. In the context of the Nancy Guthrie investigation, the realistic picture of forensic evidence is this: whatever physical evidence has been collected is being subjected to analysis that may take weeks or months to complete. Results, when they emerge, will require careful interpretation within the broader context of the investigation. They may prove definitive in some respects and ambiguous in others. They are unlikely to produce the kind of simple, dramatic revelation that true crime audiences expect and that online speculation often assumes is already available. One of the most significant ways that modern investigations differ from those conducted even a decade ago is the density of surveillance infrastructure that now exists in residential neighborhoods. Doorbell cameras, home security systems, and dash-mounted cameras in vehicles have transformed ordinary residential communities into environments where substantial amounts of visual data are generated continuously, recorded locally or to cloud services, and potentially available to investigators who are made aware of their existence and who follow appropriate legal processes to access the footage. The value of this community surveillance infrastructure to investigations like the Nancy Guthrie case is genuinely significant. A single camera positioned at an optimal location can capture vehicle movements, pedestrian activity, and temporal data that helps investigators reconstruct timelines and identify individuals who were present in an area around the time relevant events occurred. Multiple cameras in the same area, accessed and analyzed together, can produce something approaching a comprehensive picture of activity in that zone during a specific window of time. Investigators typically work to identify relevant cameras systematically, canvassing neighborhoods and commercial areas near points of interest and requesting voluntary access to footage. When voluntary access is not forthcoming, investigators may pursue legal process depending on the specific circumstances and jurisdictional rules that apply. Many homeowners cooperate willingly when they understand that their footage may help resolve a serious crime, and law enforcement often actively encourages this cooperation through public appeals. However, the interpretation of surveillance footage requires the same disciplined caution that applies to all other categories of evidence. The presence of an unfamiliar vehicle on a residential street, viewed in isolation, means very little without additional context. Delivery traffic, service providers, visiting friends, lost drivers, and many other entirely innocent circumstances can place unrecognized vehicles in any neighborhood at any time. Investigators must determine not just what was captured but what that capture means in the context of everything else they know about the case. Similarly, the absence of camera coverage in certain areas does not automatically indicate that something was deliberately concealed. Residential camera coverage in any neighborhood is inherently incomplete, with gaps determined by individual homeowners' decisions about where to place equipment. Investigators work with the footage that exists rather than the footage they might wish existed. Public appeals for information from community members who may have observed unusual activity in the relevant area of Tucson remain an important component of the investigation. Tips provided by community members sometimes contain information that investigators cannot obtain through any other means. Even observations that seem minor or uncertain to the person who made them can turn out to be significant when placed alongside other pieces of information that investigators have gathered from different sources. It would be incomplete and intellectually dishonest to discuss the Nancy Guthrie case without spending serious time on the psychological dimensions of what prolonged, public, unresolved disappearance does to the people at the center of it. These dimensions matter not only in terms of basic human empathy but also in terms of understanding the behaviors that public audiences sometimes misinterpret as significant. When a family member disappears under potentially criminal circumstances and the disappearance becomes the subject of sustained national media coverage, every person directly connected to the case is subjected to a form of pressure that is difficult to overstate. There is the private, existential grief of not knowing what happened to someone they love. There is the practical chaos of coordinating with investigators, managing media inquiries, maintaining public composure while privately falling apart, and attempting to continue functioning in everyday life under circumstances that are anything but everyday. And there is the particular cruelty of watching public discourse weaponize the uncertainty of their situation. Savannah Guthrie has continued appearing on television throughout the period of her mother's disappearance. The visible effort that requires, the professionalism and composure she has maintained in an extremely difficult public role during an extremely difficult personal period, is genuinely extraordinary. People who have experienced grief within private circumstances, without cameras present, and without national audiences watching their every expression, know how difficult it is to function. Doing so in public, in a role that requires emotional engagement and professional performance, while simultaneously experiencing one of the most distressing situations imaginable, deserves acknowledgement rather than casual analysis. Extended family members like Annie Guthrie and Tommaso are navigating similar pressures without the same professional infrastructure that comes with a major network position. They are private individuals who have been involuntarily thrust into public attention because of their relationship to someone whose own fame has amplified the case. The scrutiny they face is not something they chose or for which they necessarily have the resources and support structures to manage. The psychology of grief and acute stress is well documented in clinical literature, and its behavioral manifestations are profoundly varied and frequently counterintuitive. Some people become hyperactive, restless, and publicly engaged as a way of managing unbearable uncertainty. Others become withdrawn, flat, and apparently emotionless in a way that observers sometimes mistake for indifference or concealment. Some alternate between these states in ways that appear inconsistent. Some display intense emotion at certain moments and apparent calm at others as the psyche attempts to regulate an overwhelming experience. None of these responses, individually or in combination, carries reliable diagnostic meaning about guilt or innocence. Investigators who work regularly with families of missing persons receive training in these dynamics precisely because naive interpretation of emotional presentation can lead investigators seriously astray. Families who appear to be managing a crisis calmly are not automatically concealing something. Families who appear visibly devastated are not automatically innocent. And family members whose behavior strikes outside observers as unusual or unexpected are not automatically guilty of anything beyond being human beings experiencing an inhuman situation. The Nancy Guthrie case provides an unfortunately clear illustration of a broader phenomenon that has intensified significantly over the past decade as social media has expanded and true crime content has become one of the most consumed genres in digital media. That phenomenon is the way online collective attention transforms unresolved criminal investigations into participatory narrative experiences where communities compete to identify the most compelling theory of guilt. This transformation has real consequences for real people, and understanding those consequences is part of the responsibility that comes with covering cases like this one. When an investigation enters the online true crime ecosystem, it acquires a dynamic that operates largely independently of the actual facts. Communities of interested observers gather on Reddit, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook groups, and dedicated forums to share information, develop theories, and evaluate the credibility of various suspects and narratives. The social dynamics of these communities reward compelling theorizing rather than careful epistemics. A theory that generates emotional engagement, that fits neatly into familiar narrative structures, or that identifies a clear and satisfying villain will spread more effectively than a measured assessment acknowledging uncertainty. This creates systematic pressure toward false certainty. Once a person's name enters these communities as a potential suspect, the community's processing of that person tends to operate on a logic of cumulative suspicion rather than evidentiary evaluation. Any piece of information about the person, regardless of its actual investigative relevance, gets interpreted through the lens of the existing suspicion. Ordinary behaviors become evidence of concealment. Emotional responses become evidence of guilt. Innocent connections become sinister associations. The person's entire life gets reverse-engineered to support the conclusion that the community has already reached. This process has destroyed reputations, damaged careers, and in some cases created genuine safety risks for people who were entirely innocent of the crimes they were accused of by online communities. The cases of Richard Jewell, who was vilified as the Atlanta Olympics bomber before being cleared, and the many individuals wrongly identified as the Boston Marathon bombers in the hours after the attack, represent famous examples of the damage this dynamic can produce. Less famous but equally serious cases have occurred in connection with other high-profile crimes. In the context of the Nancy Guthrie investigation, Tommaso Soni's name has entered online discussion in ways that illustrate this dynamic clearly. The logic of online accusation in his case has moved roughly as follows. He is a family member. Family members are statistically more often involved in harm to relatives than strangers are. Therefore, his being a family member is suspicious. He is Italian-born, and various unfounded associations connect Italian origin to criminal networks. Therefore, his background is suspicious. He lives in a different city than Nancy Guthrie, and distance can enable concealment. Therefore, his location is suspicious. Each of these observations, stated plainly, reveals itself as the kind of reasoning that could render almost anyone suspicious in any case. None of them constitutes evidence of anything. The responsibility for pushing back against this dynamic does not rest entirely with online communities, where the pressure toward compelling narrative is structural and difficult to resist. It also rests with those of us who produce true crime content. The decisions made about how to frame cases, which questions to emphasize, which names to bring into discussion, and with what degree of implication, have real consequences for real people. Those decisions should be made carefully and defensively, with full awareness of the power that even a carefully worded video or podcast can have in amplifying suspicion about individuals who may be entirely innocent. One of the most fertile areas of misinterpretation in online coverage of active investigations is the analysis of official law enforcement statements. Public statements by investigators tend to be carefully worded to disclose minimum necessary information while protecting the integrity of ongoing proceedings. Understanding why they are worded the way they are, and what that means and does not mean, is essential to following the Nancy Guthrie investigation accurately. Sheriff Chris Nanos has made several public statements regarding the investigation. Online commentators have subjected those statements to detailed analysis, looking for what they take to be coded signals, meaningful omissions, or revealing linguistic patterns. This kind of analysis is almost always unreliable, for reasons rooted in how law enforcement actually communicates rather than how public audiences imagine it operates. Law enforcement officials making public statements about active investigations operate under overlapping constraints. First, they cannot disclose information that might compromise specific investigative operations or alert potential subjects to the direction of the investigation. Second, they cannot make statements that might prejudice potential future legal proceedings or provide grounds for a motion to dismiss. Third, they cannot confirm or deny investigative activities involving specific individuals without undermining those individuals' legal rights in ways that could complicate prosecution. Fourth, they are often genuinely constrained by what they themselves know at any given moment, because investigations are not single-point events but ongoing processes. These constraints produce official statements that tend to be measured, cautious, repetitive, and deliberately nonspecific in ways that frustrate public audiences who are seeking definitive information. That frustration is understandable but should not be read as meaning anything more than that investigators are doing their jobs properly. Similarly, the practice of neither confirming nor denying investigative interest in specific individuals is standard procedure designed to protect both the investigation and the individuals concerned. When law enforcement officials decline to publicly clear a person, that is not the same as publicly naming them as a suspect. When they decline to publicly rule out certain scenarios, that is not confirmation that those scenarios are actively being pursued. Navigating between what officials say and what their statements actually mean requires significant caution and a realistic understanding of the institutional context in which those statements are made. The absence of public arrest, after 96 days, should be understood within this framework. It does not signal that investigators lack evidence. It does not signal that a cover-up is in progress. It does not signal that the case has gone cold. It may simply mean that investigators are working through a complex evidentiary picture and are not yet in a position to move toward prosecution. Criminal charges require evidence that meets a legal standard of proof, and assembling that evidence in a complex case takes time. The history of major criminal investigations provides substantial evidence that patience, rather than speed, is often the defining characteristic of successful case resolution. Cases that appeared to be stalled for months or even years have been broken open by forensic breakthroughs, unexpected witness cooperation, new investigative leads, or the gradual accumulation of evidence that only became interpretable in full context. The Golden State Killer case, which remained unsolved for decades before investigators used forensic genealogy to identify Joseph James DeAngelo in 2018, is perhaps the most famous recent example of an investigation that required extraordinary patience before resolution. The case of the Zodiac Killer, which has never been definitively resolved despite enormous investigative effort and public interest, illustrates the opposite possibility, that some cases resist resolution despite the best investigative efforts. The Nancy Guthrie case sits somewhere in an uncertain middle, at 96 days into an active, well-resourced investigation. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has made clear that the case remains active and that investigative work is continuing. The involvement of a media-prominent family has brought significant public attention and, presumably, significant resources and interagency coordination to bear. Whether those factors will produce a resolution in the near term, the medium term, or a longer horizon is genuinely impossible to predict based on publicly available information. What is possible to say with confidence is that the investigative process, as described throughout this analysis, involves a careful, methodical, and time-intensive accumulation of evidence across multiple categories simultaneously. Digital forensics, physical forensic analysis, witness interviews, community surveillance review, and interagency coordination all proceed on their own timelines, and their results must then be integrated and interpreted together before investigators can be confident about moving forward toward prosecution. 96 days in the context of that process is not a long time. It may feel like a long time to a public audience experiencing the case emotionally rather than analytically. It may feel like an unbearable eternity to a family experiencing it personally. But in investigative terms, it is entirely consistent with a case proceeding at a normal and appropriate pace. This discussion has necessarily engaged throughout, with questions about what responsible true crime coverage looks like. Those questions deserve direct and final treatment before we conclude. True crime as a genre has experienced explosive growth over the past decade, and that growth has produced both genuine public benefit and significant potential for harm. On the benefit side, serious true crime journalism has helped exonerate wrongly convicted individuals, has brought investigative attention to cases that might otherwise have been neglected, has educated the public about criminal justice processes and forensic science, and has sometimes generated tips or community engagement that contributed to case resolution. On the harm side, the same genre has produced content that has defamed innocent individuals, complicated active investigations, traumatized surviving family members, and in some cases created environments of harassment and threat around people who had committed no crime. The line between benefit and harm in any specific case is not always obvious, and the people who produce true crime content have a genuine ethical obligation to think carefully about which side of that line their work falls on. For cases involving named individuals who have not been charged with any crime, that obligation is particularly acute. The legal standard for criminal responsibility, proof beyond a reasonable doubt established through formal evidentiary process, is substantially different from the social and reputational consequences that can follow when a person's name is prominently associated with criminal suspicion in widely consumed media content. A person found not guilty in court, or never charged at all, may nonetheless experience devastating personal and professional consequences as a result of irresponsible public coverage. In the Nancy Guthrie case, responsible coverage means discussing what is publicly known accurately, examining the investigative framework honestly, engaging with forensic and behavioral science realistically rather than dramatically, and maintaining a clear and explicit distinction between confirmed facts, reasonable investigative questions, and unsubstantiated speculation. It means taking seriously the potential consequences of naming private individuals in connection with criminal allegations that have not been established through any formal process. At TRUECRIMEHEX, we take those responsibilities seriously. Our goal is not to produce the most dramatic or most sensational coverage of this case. Our goal is to produce the most accurate, most thoughtful, and most genuinely useful coverage we can, in a way that respects both the public interest in understanding what happened to Nancy Guthrie and the rights and dignity of the individuals connected to her case. 96 days. That is how long Nancy Guthrie has been missing. That is how long her daughters have been living with the devastating uncertainty of not knowing what happened to their mother. That is how long investigators have been working to answer a question that may not yet have a publicly available answer, not because the investigation is failing, but because complex cases require the kind of careful, methodical, evidence-based work that does not fit neatly into the timelines that public audiences prefer. Throughout this analysis, we have covered an enormous amount of territory. We have examined the publicly confirmed facts of the case and drawn a clear boundary around what remains unknown. We have discussed Tommaso Soni's connection to the Guthrie family in genuinely contextual terms, distinguishing between the entirely ordinary investigative relevance of being a family member and the unsupported leap to criminal suspicion that online commentary has frequently made. We have explored the realistic mechanics of modern forensic investigation, including DNA analysis, digital forensics, vehicle data, trace evidence, and surveillance reconstruction, in terms that acknowledge both their power and their very real limitations. We have examined how behavioral analysis actually works, and why it cannot do what television dramas and online commentators suggest it can. We have discussed the psychological toll that prolonged, public uncertainty places on families and close associates, and why that toll can produce behavioral manifestations that naive observers mistakenly interpret as meaningful. We have analyzed how official law enforcement communication works and why measured, cautious statements should not be decoded as containing hidden accusations or admissions. We have confronted directly the online discourse dynamics that transform unresolved investigations into participatory accusation narratives. And we have been honest about the harm that those dynamics can cause and about the responsibility that true crime content producers share in either amplifying or resisting them. And throughout all of it, we have returned repeatedly to the single most important principle that governs responsible engagement with cases like this one: the distinction between possibility and evidence, between suspicion and proof, between the questions that legitimate investigation must answer and the answers that responsible commentary is not in a position to provide. Nancy Guthrie deserves justice. She deserves an investigation that is thorough, patient, and uncorrupted by the pressures of public expectation or sensational media narrative. She deserves a resolution that comes through evidence, established through proper legal process, that can withstand the scrutiny that courts impose and that truth requires. The individuals connected to her case, including her daughters, her son-in-law, her neighbors, and anyone else whose name has entered the public discussion, deserve to be treated as human beings rather than as characters in a story that the internet has decided must have a particular ending. Until verified answers emerge from the investigation that Sheriff Chris Nanos and the Pima County Sheriff's Department are conducting, the most important contribution any of us can make is to hold the line between what we know and what we are tempted to assume. To acknowledge uncertainty rather than filling it with invented certainty. To remain curious and engaged without becoming reckless or accusatory. And to remember that at the center of all of this is a real woman, missing for 96 days, whose fate her family is waiting to learn. This is TrueCrimeHEX. We will continue following this case and reporting on verified developments as they become publicly available. We are committed to covering this story with the seriousness, the accuracy, and the human decency that it demands. Stay informed. Stay critical. Stay compassionate. And stay with us.